Hi everybody, welcome back. I'm Seth Monahan, professor of music theory and occasional YouTuber, and this is video number 5 in my series on the basics of classical harmony and counterpoint. This installation is called All About Triads. So perhaps we should start with the most basic question of all, which is, what is a triad? This is easy. A triad is a 3-note chord built from 2 intervals of a third stacked on top of each other. And there are 4 types built from different combinations of major and minor thirds. They are diminished, minor, major, and augmented. And I'll tell you in a moment why I put them in this particular order. But first, let's look at how each one is built, starting with diminished. A diminished triad is built from 2 identically sized thirds. They're both minor. You take one minor third, you stack it on top of another one, and you get a diminished triad. So built up on A, it looks like this. With a minor triad, we combine thirds of different types. Specifically, we put a minor third on the bottom, hence the name, and a major third on the top. So in A, that one looks like this. The major triad also uses 2 types of thirds, but now with the major third on the bottom and the minor one on top. And in A, it looks and sounds like this. And with the augmented triad, we're back to using 2 thirds of the same size, except now they're both major thirds, and it sounds like this. Now, the reason I've ordered them like this is simple. As we move down the list, we get each new triad by raising one note in the previous chord by semitone. So if we start with A diminished, and we raise that top note E flat to E natural, we get A minor. And looking ahead, you can see if we take that C, raise it by semitone, we get A major. And once again, we raise the top note, E becomes E sharp, and we get augmented. Now, another important structural property I want you to notice is what I call each triad's bounding fifth. That's to say, the fifth that falls between its outer notes when it's written as a little stack like this. With the diminished triad, that bounding fifth, A to E flat, is, not coincidentally, a diminished fifth. That's where the chord gets its name. With major and minor triads, that outer fifth is perfect, A to E natural. And then with the augmented triad, big surprise, the outer fifth is augmented, once again explaining the chord's name, A to E sharp. Now, the quality of these bounding fifths correlates to another important property, which is that of acoustic consonance. The major and minor triads, with their perfect outer fifth, are consonant. They contain no dissonant intervals, and that's why we see these a lot more than we see the other ones. By contrast, the diminished and augmented triads are acoustically dissonant, meaning they're also rarer and have more specialized uses. Now let's talk about naming the notes in a triad. Within any given triad, the individual notes have special names. So let's take an A minor triad, again stacked tightly in thirds like this. The bottom note here, A natural, is called the root. It's the note the triad is named after. Above that is the chordal third, in this case C natural. And it's called the chordal third because when we arrange the chord's notes in a tight little stack like this, it lies a third above the root. So by this same logic, we call E natural the chordal fifth, since it lies a fifth above the root when we put the chord in a little stack like this. Now, it's important to recognize that triads are defined by the notes they contain, but not how those notes are arranged. So a triad's 3 notes, or degrees as they're sometimes called, can be doubled or placed in any register. So in the present case, that means any combination of A, C, and E will count as an A minor triad. To make this especially vivid, here are 3 arrangements, or voicings, of the notes of A minor. The arrangements could hardly be more different, and yet because each contains only A, C, and E, they're all equally instances of A minor. Let's look really closely at the one on the left. Here we have the root at the very bottom. And then above that we have an instance of the chordal fifth, E. And then a doubling of the root above that. And then the chordal third above that. And then finally another doubling of the root on the top. But we don't need the root to be on the bottom at all, as the other two voicings show. There we have the chordal third and the fifth on the bottom, and these chords are still A minor. So the category of A minor is very inclusive. It's going to include any combination of A, C, and E. Now, having these various voicings on screen also gives us a chance to talk about what's called position. The first chord is in what we call open position because the notes are arranged in a way that there are gaps where we could have included another chord tone but didn't. So here, for instance, we could have included another E in the chord, but we didn't, and that was my choice. The second chord, too, is in open position, full of gaps, which I hope you can pretty easily see. By contrast, the third chord is in what we call closed position, meaning that between the outermost notes there are no such gaps. It's filled with as many of the notes of A minor as possible. Now, I know if you're just looking casually, you might see right there, well, that's kind of a gap there between E and A. Yes, that's a wide space, but there are no notes in it, the chord of A minor, that fit in there. You can't just take some other note, and like an F sharp, and stick it in there for some reason. That's a cool chord, but it's no longer A minor at that point. So this one's in closed position, unlike the two previously. So now it's time to move on to a slightly more complicated task, but one you're going to face often. This is how to identify a triad. Let's say you're walking down the street and a piece of paper falls from the sky with this mystery chord on it. Some people might wonder, say, where the paper came from or who was dropping stuff on them, but as a musician, you're going to want to know what chord is this. And you'll get the answer in 3 steps. First, obviously, you need to identify all the notes. Then you have to arrange it as a stack of thirds. And finally, you'll need to determine its quality. So let's try this out. At the very bottom, we have A. Above that is an F sharp, and then a C sharp, and then an A, and another F sharp. And as you probably already guessed, having 2 A's or 2 F sharps doesn't change anything. They're just duplications of notes that are already in the chord. So effectively, we have a 3-note chord, A, F sharp, and C sharp. So our next task is to arrange this as a stack of thirds. Or more specifically, we need to see which closed position, again, tightly packed, which closed position permutation gives us a stack of thirds. So we're going to pack these 3 notes as closely as possible and see which of the 3 possible orderings gives us a stack of thirds. Here's A on the bottom, tightly packed, F sharp on the bottom, tightly packed, C sharp on the bottom, tightly packed. And hopefully you can see that we only get a stack of thirds when F sharp is on the bottom. So that means F sharp is the root. It means that A is the chordal third and C sharp is the chordal fifth. Now all that remains is to figure out its quality. So we can ask some very basic questions here. First, we can ask, what is the interval of its bounding fifth, the outer fifth from F sharp to C sharp? In this case, I hope you can hear and see that we have a perfect fifth. And then what's the interval of the bottom third? So if it's a perfect fifth on the outside, we know it's going to be a major or a minor triad. We're going to name this triad after what the bottom third is. And here, F sharp to A is a minor third. That makes this a minor triad. So we know the root, we know the quality. We can now answer the question, what triad is that? It's F sharp minor. So now let's talk about triads in their native environment, which is in a key. Until now, we've just been looking at isolated triads floating in the ether, but normally when we encounter a triad, it's in some piece where there's music in a key. So every major key contains 7 triads, 1 on each scale degree. Here we're in the key of D major, and here are the 7 triads, 1 built on each scale degree. Hopefully you can see what I've done. I've just gone up the scale, building a stack of thirds on each note of the scale. So in any major key, chords built on scale degrees 1, 4, and 5 are going to be major. That's an automatic feature of the system. It's true in any major key. Chords built on 1, 4, and 5 using the notes of the key are major. And chords built on 2, 3, and 6 will automatically be minor. The odd man out at the end, scale degree 7. When we build a chord on that note, we're going to get a diminished triad. So here are our major chords, our minor chords, and our 1 diminished triad. And you can hear, I hope, how dissonant that is compared to its siblings. The root of each triad determines, in turn, what Roman numeral it gets. You may have seen chords labeled with Roman numerals. This is where we're going to start doing that. The major triads are all named with uppercase Roman numerals, uppercase reflecting the fact that they're major triads. The minor triads get lowercase Roman numerals, so the chord built on scale degree 2 gets a lowercase Roman numeral 2, and so on. And then to show that the 7 triad is diminished, we use a lowercase Roman numeral with a little circle next to it. That's going to always tell us when we see a Roman numeral with a little circle that it's some kind of diminished chord. And we also borrow the functional names that we saw when we built scales. These can also be applied to the chords as well. So these are familiar names, I hope, to you by now, and they can be applied equally to the notes of the scale. We can say that in D major, D is the tonic note, or the chords built on those notes. So in D major, the chord built on the tonic degree is the tonic chord, just like the chord built on the subdominant note is the subdominant chord. So that's major. In minor, things get a bit trickier because of the variable forms of scale degrees 6 and 7. You remember from video 3 that the harmonic and melodic minor scales raise various notes of the natural minor by half step. And as I hinted in that lecture, these altered notes are going to appear in chords and they're going to change the nature of those chords. So before we get to those though, let's start with the chords we can make just with the notes of the natural minor scale. Here I've kept us in D, now we're in D minor. And here are our 7 triads built on those notes. Now in this case, there's a pattern similar to major in that the chords built on 1, 4, and 5 all have the same quality. In this case, they're minor. Remember, chords built on 1, 4, and 5 in major were major. Here, they're minor, just if we're using the natural minor scale. Chords built on 3, 6, and 7 now will be major, and these will get uppercase Roman numerals. And now our diminished triad falls on scale degree 2. So there we're going to see a little 2 with a little circle reminding us that it's a diminished triad. So now let's deal with those altered notes, the notes that are changed by the melodic and harmonic minor scale. And although a lot of combinations are possible, I'm only going to talk about the ones that you actually really see in music. I'm not going to give you a bunch of chords that don't really exist. So starting with harmonic minor, forms of 5 and 7 routinely use the raised scale degree 7 of harmonic minor. That's to say they'll contain a leading tone rather than a subtonic. Or more specifically still, in this case, it's going to mean C sharps as opposed to Cs. In the case of the dominant, that means turning a minor triad into a major one and adjusting the Roman numeral accordingly. And this isn't just an occasional thing. In the classical style, the dominant almost always appears as a major triad, one that has that extra accidental raising its chordal third. And we see something similar with 7. In natural minor, we have a major triad built on the subtonic. So here that's C, E, G, built on the subtonic note. But just as often, we're going to see a triad built on the leading tone on raised scale degree 7, making a diminished triad. So there's our lowercase 7 with a little circle, reminding us this is diminished. Now I want you to notice something important here. When we raised scale degree 7 in the dominant, we were merely changing the quality of the chord, right? We weren't changing the root. We were changing the quality. We made a minor triad into a major one. Here in 7, by changing C to C sharp, we're actually changing the root of the chord. The root is C sharp rather than C natural now. Put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But first, I just want to point out that the subdominant chord, 4, occasionally uses the raised scale degree 6 of melodic minor, making for a major triad. So here's minor 4, here's major 4, with a big Roman numeral accordingly. It's not that common, but I want you to know that it does exist. Now, because of all these alterations, we obviously have more chords to keep track of in minor than we did in major. But we can organize these a bit like this by dividing them up so that it's clear that there are still really only 7 Roman numerals, but that some of these chords appear in multiple forms. So where the tonic, for instance, will always be minor, or the mediant will always be major, other chords have multiple versions under different circumstances. And of course, we'll get to what those circumstances actually are in later videos. Just a few more points. One is that the triads in minor also take functional names just like in major. But again, scale degree 7 has a red flag. So earlier I pointed out that the two versions of 7 are actually built on different roots. A major triad built on natural 7, and a diminished triad built on raised 7. These chords also get different names. The former is called the subtonic triad, and the latter one is the leading tone triad. This is something you want to be really clear on because some students get a bit confused here. In this case, think about this. The Roman numeral tells us not only the chord quality, right? Big 7, major, little 7 with a circle, diminished. In this case, the Roman numeral actually tells us which note is the root, C or C sharp, natural 7 or raised 7. This, again, wasn't the case with the dominant, where the root was always A, whether or not we raised the leading tone. Now, our last topic has to do with what's called inversions of triads. Earlier in the video, we discussed some aspects of what we call the voicing of triads. In other words, how the notes are actually distributed. But we skipped over the most important feature of these voicings, which is the question of which chord degree, the root, the third, or the fifth, appears in the bass voice, the lowest voice. In classical harmony, triads are always classified by what chord degree appears in the bass, and we call these different permutations inversions. Let's try this out with E major. When the root of the chord is in the bass, the chord is said to be in root position. And by saying it's in root position, we're giving no information at all about how the upper voices are distributed. They could be in closed position, as we see here, or open position. There might be doublings, there might be 3 voices, 5 voices, 10 voices, doesn't matter. Root position means that E is the lowest note. When the chordal third is in the bass, we say the chord is in first inversion. That means that the root of the chord will now be in some upper voice. The root is still important, but it's no longer the same as the bass. In root position, the root is the bass. In first inversion, the chordal third is the bass, and the root is in some upper voice. This distinction between root and bass is one to be really clear on because it confuses a lot of students. Really think about this. The root of a triad never changes. If you have E, G sharp, and B, E is always the root, whether or not the triad is played by 11 flutes, 16 harmonicas, whether it's written on a cantaloupe, doesn't matter. The root of a triad never changes, and it can appear in any voice and any register. But the bass is whatever note happens to be in the lowest voice in a particular instance of a chord. In other words, the root can be determined in the abstract. If you ask me, what is the root of E major, I will always be right to say E. But if you say, what's the bass of E major, I'd say the question doesn't make any sense because you have to show me a particular E major chord so I can see what the bottom note is. So finally, to complete our task here, when the chordal fifth is in the bass, we get a triad in second inversion. Now, I want to make just 2 additional points. One is not to get confused and call root position a first inversion. Sometimes people think, okay, there are 3 different positions for a triad: first inversion, second inversion, third inversion. That makes a certain kind of sense, but it's wrong. There's root position, first inversion, and second inversion. The second point is just to stress again that when we're talking about chord inversions, the placement of the upper voices doesn't matter. It's only the lowest voice that determines the inversion. So here, for instance, are 4 voicings of E major in first inversion. To tell the inversion, we just look at the lowest note, which we still call the bass, I should point out, even if it's way up in a high register. In the last chord here, which I can't even play on my MIDI keyboard because I don't have those notes, that G sharp is very high, but it's still the, quote, bass of the chord because it's the lowest one, and because G sharp is the lowest note, that makes these first inversion triads. Now, if you've studied triad inversion before, you might be surprised that I didn't use what's called figured bass to describe them. You might have, for instance, learned at some point that a second inversion chord can be called a 6/4 chord and written with 2 little integers on top of each other next to the Roman numeral. We're going to start using that notation in video 7, but before then, in video 6, we're going to spend some time getting to know what figured bass is and actually does, because students can be very fuzzy on that. So thank you for tuning in. I hope to see you with the next video.